Oh great, it's one of those games. This is the tale of a teenage girl and her innocuous dream to finally go to school. The only problem? 78 years ago, mutants overtook the Earth's surface and forced all of the mankind into Tokyo's underground subways. But not all hope's lost. Donning her grandmother's old school uniform, Hisako, a third-generation underground dweller, swears to return the mankind to the surface, make friends with everyone in the entire world, and start a school beneath an endless blue sky. One of the first things I do before I talk about a game for this channel is to see what other people are saying about it so I can add to the conversation instead of just restating what others have already said. When it comes to Dead or School, it turns out not a lot of people have talked about it. I think I found like 5 or 6 channels that reviewed it. Yet, even with such a small sample size, I heard a particular word in every video. Janky. And I have to say, that is exactly the word I kept saying as I played through Dead or School. But I evoke the word janky with sincere reverence. I loved Dead or School, jank and all. In fact, I feel its jankiness adds to its charm. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get into all that. First, let's talk about the bulk of what the game is about. Combat. I hope you like combat, because Dead or School sure has a lot of it. So much so that I actually felt it could dial it back a bit. Don't get me wrong, I love me some mindless hacking and slashing, but there were times when the game was just being cruel. The first thing you'll need to know about the combat is that Hisako holds 3 weapons at all times. A melee weapon, a gun, and a launcher, which is an overpowered gun with huge explosions. Think rocket launcher or a literal black hole generator. Second, each weapon has durability that degrades with each hit. What Dead or School likes to do is lock you into battles, like in Guacamelee and Vernal Edge. Then, they just keep throwing waves of enemies at you. There's a finite amount of enemies per wave, but man, sometimes these waves just keep coming. I'd constantly break my sword and use up all my bullets way before clearing a locked-in battle, only to take a few steps and get locked into another battle with a dozen more enemy waves. And there are no healing items for your HP or weapons. You can only heal and restock weapons at save points. Once you leave a save point, you're on your own until you reach the next save point. And the game offers no grace. If I run into a room, clear a battle sequence, and then return to a prior save point, you better believe Dead or School makes you refight that sequence again. The game constantly reminds you that supplies are sparse and enemies are plenty, which is obnoxious. Apt given the state of the world, but obnoxious nonetheless. Hisako has a regular attack and a strong attack for each of the 3 weapon types, and weapon types can be swapped on the fly, meaning you can seamlessly switch out your sword for your gun with the press of a button. This adds a twitchy, strategic element to the fray. There are also tons of weapons to choose from. On the melee side of things, you start with a pipe and eventually get katanas, axes, chainsaws, and other instruments to bludgeon your enemies to death. As for guns, assault rifles, sniper rifles, flamethrowers, and more are on the menu. And launchers? Man, the diversity and destruction on those bad boys get absurd and out of hand real quick. It goes without saying, there's a lot of variety on offer here for all your mutant myrtleizing needs. But none of this matters if Hisako doesn't have the moves to keep herself from getting torn limb from limb. Thankfully, she's as agile as they come. Not only does she start with a double jump, but she also has a roll evasion that triggers bullet time if you dodge at just the right moment, allowing for a follow-up with a flurry of attacks. This risk-reward mechanic adds a lot of engagement to a potentially mindless combat system, so it's highly appreciated. To keep all this in check, Dead or School utilizes a stamina system, so you'll need to be mindful of every move and action you make to prevent yourself from tiring out and becoming mutant food. My only critique of its stamina system is that it depletes stamina as you shoot your gun. I have to watch my stamina and my magazine while I'm firing? Lame. Overall, Dead or School's combat is simple yet satisfying thanks to its impressive weapon variety keeping it fresh. I'm going to talk about the progression systems and exploration in Dead or School, and this is where things are going to get awkward, because Dead or School isn't actually a Metroidvania. It looks like a Metroidvania to the untrained eye, what with its map and all. How could you look at that and not immediately think Metroidvania? But, alas, a Metroidvania it is not. At least, not in the purest sense. The one thing Dead or School lacks to make it a pure Metroidvania is ability gating. There are no maneuverability skills to unlock within the game, so what Hisako starts with is what you get. Any locked paths you find can be overcome by finding keys, switches, or triggering events. However, since Debtor School does pretty much everything else exactly like a Metroidvania, I think it's fair to call it a Metroidvania if you look at the genre on a spectrum. Perhaps a Metroidvania Light or Metroidvania-like? I'll let you decide. Debtor School is also very linear with its progression, but allows backtracking. And you might need to do some backtracking if you want to make sure you do all the game's subquests, i.e. side quests. There are a lot of collectibles to find, so venturing off the beaten path typically rewards handsomely. Weapons and money are always exciting to discover, but it's the souvenirs and the refugees you like to find. Finding them increases your stats, such as HP and stamina, or weight and skill points. More on those last two in a sec. You can also increase these stats by killing mutants to level up, which is absolutely necessary to do. I fought some bosses while underleveled and felt the difference once I grinded to their level. But I digress. With each level, you get a skill point to use in Hisako's skill trees, of which there are 3, one for each weapon type. The skills you obtain range from actual new combat abilities to stat increases to passive buffs, offering lots of customization. Speaking of customization, there's also a customization option in the game's menu. This is where the game gets a bit messy when it comes to its UI, but once you wrap your head around it, it's the most addicting part of the game. Essentially, this menu lets you equip your weapons as well as upgrade them and give them perks. Remember all that money you've been collecting? Here's where you spend it. Sure, you could spend your money at vending machines and at the store, but with how often enemies drop weapons and perks, why would you? You'll also need gears to upgrade your weapons, but you'll find so many of those while exploring or by selling weapons that they become a non-issue pretty quickly. Each weapon can be upgraded by 10 levels, with each level increasing its damage output. The more uncommon purple modification gears randomly add perks to your weapons. This could be anything like boost HP by 2%, or you're invincible while reloading, or you now have a drone that follows you and shoots at your enemies. There's just something about the randomness of the perks that makes it a ton of fun. Also, each weapon has 2 slots where you can insert perks you find while exploring. For instance, an enemy can randomly drop the drone perk. It's a thrill each time you get to a save point just so you can see all the perks you picked up along the way. What's less thrilling is what I alluded to earlier, the game's UI. You'll find a ton of stuff while fighting, and combing through all that stuff becomes cumbersome. Sifting through all of it is a job unto itself. I guess it's not the worst problem to have, but some kind of search feature would have helped, especially if you're looking for something specific. When it comes to exploration, each area, referred to as stages, is a self-contained map. You travel between stages via a subway train, and fast travel within stages is unlocked from the get-go. Nothing is ever hidden from you. The map always shows your latest objective, as well as all sub-quest markers and any points of interest, such as souvenir locations, refugees, and even item boxes that contain rare weapons and perks. All you gotta do is put in the work of killing the millions of mutants they'll undoubtedly hurl at you along the way. Simply put, exploration isn't the most exciting. They even tell you where locked doors are and where to find their respective keys. It's a bummer, but the game's focus is on the combats, so I think the devs wanted to remove anything that distracted from splattering mutants. That's my theory anyway. Let's talk about the game's presentation and atmosphere. Remember when I brought up the word janky at the beginning of this video? We're finally about to go down that rabbit hole. Man, where do I even start? I guess with the obvious. Boy is this game ugly. I'm talking budget Dreamcast levels of ugly. Hisako is a 2D sprite against 3D backgrounds, and all the enemies are 3D models, making Hisako and the other anime-styled humans stick out even more. There's a coherent art direction for each of the enemies, but their textures are just bland and unrefined. But you won't notice how awkward and ugly they are because the camera is zoomed back so freaking far. I definitely don't recommend playing this in handheld mode if you're playing on the Switch. But to the devs' credit, they did a good job with making the environments interesting, considering you're stuck in underground subways and tunnels the majority of the game. They do a fantastic job of making each biome distinct and fascinating. They do this not only with varied environments, but with all kinds of weird optional things you can do to obtain collectibles. The devs were definitely aware they were making a goofy video game and loved to remind players. There were so many times I'd veer off course to some isolated area to find myself doing some of the most superfluous and unrealistic puzzles or activities. Sometimes you had to move hydraulics to kill mutants, or you were manipulating gears to maneuver mutants to blow something up. There's even a part where you surf on a car, and another where you ride a minecart like in Donkey Kong Country. My favorite by far was when you had to copy the song a mutant guitarist was playing. Did it make any sense? Nope. But was it stupid and fun? You betcha. There's no logical reason within the world why these scenarios exist, but they were fun distractions nonetheless, and always made me laugh. Returning to the jank, they use pre-rendered cutscenes when introducing areas or new enemies or bosses, and they look just awful, like they compressed the crap out of them. And during one of these boss introductions, they actually had the characters talk through it, obscuring 3/4 of the screen with their profile pic and speech bubbles. They also use these gross-looking renders during key events, but they don't use sound effects. There's this one cutscene with huge explosions, and there's not a single sound to be heard other than the music playing in the background. It was so jarring. And oh man, the music. Let me start by saying I absolutely love the music in this game. That being said, it's butt rock. The entire soundtrack is the most generic rock music you could ever hear. I researched the OST and found this game doesn't credit a composer. Why? Because they took all the music from free web sources. The track you've been listening to throughout this video is called Rock Music Loops, and I got it straight from SoundCloud. It's a medley of a bunch of generic rock riffs mashed together into a single track, and some of the tracks from the game are in this loop. What makes this even funnier is that the devs didn't even loop the music properly. Some tracks just stop, offer a second or so of silence, and then pick back up from the beginning. I couldn't believe my ears when I first heard it. But that's nothing compared to what I read. We've finally come to the narrative section, and as you would expect, the jank train just keeps a-rolling. Before we get into the story, let's talk localization. I feel as if this game wasn't localized. I'm not saying it was mistranslated. I actually can't think of a time when the writing didn't make sense. It just says things weird. Like, the spirit of what they were trying to convey is there, it just took them longer to actually arrive. So much of the dialogue sounds awkward to native English speakers, and I'd wager that's because they translated directly from Japanese. Whatever the case, the end product is unintentionally hilarious most of the time. They put "the" in front of things that don't need it, like their Starfire from Teen Titans. I don't know how many times I laughed at "the mankind." And they put S's where they shouldn't, like "the combats." And there's all kinds of other goofiness to be had here. It kinda detracts from the gravity of some of the game situations, but it also kinda gives the game its own flavor. With each awkward phrasing or mismanaged word, I couldn't help but smile and look forward to the next. I can't say I wasn't entertained. But despite all the wonky translations, the game's plot is surprisingly solid. If you've watched any of my videos, then you know narrative plays a huge role in my enjoyment with Metroidvanias. I'm 100% serious when I say Debtor School's story is genuinely fantastic. I was stunned by how enthralled I was. No joke. Obviously, the game doesn't take itself too seriously. I mean, Hisako's motivation for saving the mankind is so she can go to school. I get that that's dumb, and I guarantee the devs understand that too. But what caught me off guard was how structurally sound the narrative actually was. It follows a solid 3-act structure and nails every story beat along the way. There are twists all over the place, and the devs never let up on the tension. New elements continually get added throughout the journey to keep the pressure on the protagonists, and I got invested. There was even enough intrigue sown throughout to keep me guessing. What's the origin of the mutants? Why does nobody remember anything prior to the Human Mutant War 78 years ago? Who's the silver-haired girl on the surface with all the mutants? And each revelation is fun and interesting, and it helped that I actually liked the characters. Hisako's kinda lame with her tropey shonen anime-esque "I have a dream and nothing will stop me because I have the power of friendship" personality, but Eureka is an interesting character with decent growth. And Daiba has incredibly relatable motivations and even has a tender moment when he learns about his father's fate during a sub-quest. But where the narrative really shines is in its world building. Though some of the dialogue can be redundantly heavy-handed, there's some interactions between characters that help make this dystopian world feel believable. There's an organization called the Civilization Investigators, and their mission is to study the relics of humanity's past in order to find a way to combat the mutants and regain the surface. But they also create tension with the other underground citizens by hoarding all the guns and selling them back to the people at a profit, citing that inspecting and maintaining weapons isn't cheap. Then there's the Diggers, a group responsible for creating the tunnels for the mankind to live in after they were forced underground. And even they have a contentious history because the original diggers would just dig all over the place, causing collapses from structures above their tunnels and unintentionally killing the people they were trying to save. An addictive drug exists that people can take that makes them lose their mind, so it's easier to deal with being stuck underground, but the devs really didn't dive too deeply into it, which is a shame. The point is, I was surprised at how competent the narrative was when the rest of the game is less competent. Eventually, curiosity got the best of me, so I looked up the game's director and quickly discovered that was a mistake. So, there's some good news and some weird news. Good news, the director actually writes and illustrates his own manga series called Machine Doll Nanami-chan, and this game is a what-if scenario based on that series. That explains why this janky game has a legit narrative. As for the weird news, he's a hentai artist. And that explains the elephant in the room. The game's fan service. Admittedly, the game's fan service is relatively tame. You won't see anything lewd throughout Hisako's journey, thankfully, especially because I'm pretty sure she's underaged. The most you'll see from her are some jiggle physics when her uniform tears in battle. The most risque scene is when Eureka puts on a torn dress and strikes an odd pose. And of course my wife and daughter walked into my office during this scene. They still won't look me in the eyes. Jiggle physics and fan service aside, the only thing about the narrative that disappointed me was the lack of multiple endings, at least to my knowledge. Again, hardly anybody's talking about this game, so it's hard to do any meaningful research on it. That being said, there were a bunch of plot holes I was having trouble filling in, like why was Asako so hardcore? She's just a teenage girl, yet they show her ramming her fist through a mutant's gut and chucking it like it's nothing. Through research outside of the game, I discovered that Hisako's grandmother is the protagonist for the manga series, and that the grandmother has an android's core as a heart, I think. But I don't know how that would translate to powering up her granddaughter nearly 80 years later. But it might, so whatever. There are a few other plot holes, but I don't want to potentially spoil anything. And now we're at the part of the video where I give my verdict on whether or not you should play the game. Honestly, I don't know if I can recommend it, even to hardcore Metroidvania fans. This game's just so niche and janky, both in design and performance. If I had to describe the game's ideal demographic, it'd be people who like Mystery Science Theater 3000 or Rift Tracks, and sci-fi anime, and hack and slash video games, and have a high tolerance for jankiness, and either enjoy or can ignore gratuitous fan service. With a list so big, you can see why I said it's niche. Thankfully, I hit everything on that checklist and ended up having a blast. Ultimately, the glue that held the game together to create an enjoyable experience was this pervading sense of passion, like the devs needed to share their vision, yet didn't have the technical prowess to do so. And I can totally get behind that. There's just something so punk rock about getting your message out no matter what, and this do-it-yourself mentality gets my respect. And what is that message they needed to get out? As long as there's hope, no matter how small or how ridiculous the idea that drives you, people can overcome anything as long as they work together. It's nothing new, but it checks out. Dead School is incredibly rough around the edges, but through all its faults, it's a diamond in the rough. A true cult classic in every sense of the word. If you decide to jump into its crazy, mutant-infested world, maybe switch the difficulty to easy. The game is just too janky to play on normal without excessive grinding and frustration. Not to mention that the game kinda overstays its welcome. It took me 23.5 hours to complete the game, and I'm not gonna lie, I was ready for it to end a couple of stages before the credits rolled. It was such a relief to finally see the credits, and equally as hilarious to see how they translated the job descriptions. Make map. Lol.